Hey y'all, if y'all have a lot of t-shirts laying around that you just don't use anymore, stay tuned for this t-shirt blanket tutorial. Today we are going to work on a t-shirt blanket. This is where you take many t-shirts and you create a blanket out of them. So today I'm going to be using 16 t-shirts from my t-shirt collection. The first thing you need to do is measure out all of the graphics from the t-shirt that you plan on keeping to use in a t-shirt blanket in order to find out what is the biggest size that you need for the squares that you'll be cutting out of the t-shirts. From measuring all of the graphics, I determined that a 15 by 15 inch square would be sufficient for keeping all of the graphics that I want. The next step is to cut your t-shirts and prepare them for cutting the squares. So what I did, I cut up the sides of each t-shirt in order to separate the front face from the back face. And this is also useful if you want to use the face of the shirt that you won't be using for the blanket in another project. And I show an example of this in a previous video with my two-tone shirt. So here I show how to cut the shirts using scissors, or you can use rotary cutter in this example, which is a lot easier just to get that cut up the side, and then use scissors to cut the sleeves. Once you have all of your faces of the shirts cut, now you'll want to add fusible interfacing. And this is an optional step. You don't have to use fusible interfacing, but it's helpful in order to stiffen up the material of the shirt to use for your blanket. And you can find interfacing at your hobby store or fabric store, and you want the kind that you can iron on. So I measured the interfacing to generally cover the area of the graphic that I want. And I found instructions on how to apply it online because when I bought it from the fabric store, it didn't really have instructions. They say to use a damp towel between the iron and the interfacing, and that worked pretty well. At some point I did ditch the towel and just do it directly on the interfacing, which I wouldn't recommend because sometimes the interfacing kind of melted. But overall, I think it worked very well. After you apply the interfacing to all of your t-shirts, now you'll finally cut out the squares that you will be using to sew the blanket together. So here I've outlined a 15 by 15 inch square and cut out the squares using my sewing ruler. I'm double checking the measurement at every point just to make sure I'm getting the measurements that I need. It's kind of satisfying to have all the squares done. So for my blanket t-shirt, my t-shirt blanket, I wanted a certain pattern. I planned this out ahead of time. I'm using colors or shirts from the two schools that I went to, two universities I went to, and the colors were red, white, yellow, and black, which also happens to be the colors of the Maryland flag. And so I thought it would be perfect to use those shirts for this project and to have a nice little theme going on and color scheme going on. So now it's almost time to start sewing. What I did was sewed each column squares together. So here you want to lay the squares facing each other, and you want to either pin one side or you can use the clips to clip the side of the squares that you're going to sew first. And then you just start sewing. I use a regular straight stitch If you're looking at my sewing skills, I am still in the beginning stages of sewing. So it might look a little not polished in terms of sewing, but it got the job done. Once you've sewn all the squares of each column, now you're going to sew together the columns. And so what I wanted to do was start in the middle because I wanted to make sure the lines in the very middle of the blanket lined up. And then going from the center, they might not line up as neatly because of different measurements of the squares, different way I sewed the squares together. But I really wanted the center point to line up pretty well. And I also decided I wanted to mark out the line where I'm going to sew. I thought this would be useful in order to make sure I'm staying straight on my stitching. So you're just going to put the columns facing each other and then pin one side. I will say marking out the line where I wanted the stitch to be sewn was pretty helpful for me in order to make sure it stayed pretty straight while I was sewing. And there's the middle. It didn't get exactly straight or exactly lined up, but it still looks pretty good. And so you're going to sew all of the columns together. And I also made sure to press down the seams between the squares in order just to have the seams lie a little flatter. It was helpful when you sewed the squares and the columns together. And here is all the squares put together. It looks so pretty and beautiful. And in order to finish the blanket, I added fleece to the back side of the blanket. So I just got a couple of yards of fleece material from the fabric store, and I pinned the edges of the outside of the blanket and the fleece. And I'm going to sew along the edges there. I will note that when I put the sides of the fleece and the blanket together, I tried to make sure the side of the fleece that I wanted on the outside was facing the graphics of the t-shirt. So when you flipped it inside out, it'll be the right side of the fleece facing out. So once you're done sewing your fleece to your t-shirts, you're going to cut away any excess material of the fleece or even the t-shirt. And also when you're cutting or when you're sewing the t-shirt and the fleece together, make sure you're leaving a hole, like maybe a square's length of between the fleece and the blanket open, so you can flip the material inside out. So here you see that there is a hole left open that you'll need to hand stitch in order to close the blanket. In order to close the blanket, I tried to do a blind stitch. I believe that's how you call it. So you just want to fold the edge of the t-shirt blanket and the fleece that you want to be closed, and you're going to sew kind of inside each of the folded over parts so you can't really see it from the outside. I'm not really sure how to explain it, and I couldn't get a good video of it, but here's the finished edge where I blind stitched the blanket and the fleece together. And the final step, I tried to sew like the corners just to make sure the blanket and the fleece kind of stuck together and wasn't like an empty bag really. I tried to do that, but the thread kept getting caught in the fleece and it wasn't really going in and out. So after a couple of those, I just abandoned that idea. But here's the final result. I love the colors. I love the pattern that I mapped out. I'm so happy I got to use these t-shirts in a way that will be useful. The blanket is nice and warm and cozy. You can definitely snuggle up with it on the couch while you're reading, while you're watching TV, even take a little nap. Hope you found this helpful. Thanks for watching.